The Waiting Cold. December 16th, 1944. The bitter cold of the Ardennes forest was our constant companion. It gnawed at our bones, a chill that seemed to seep into our very souls. For days we had huddled in the frozen trees waiting for orders, for movement, for anything to break the oppressive silence of this white frozen wasteland. The forest was quiet, too quiet, but we knew that across the snow-covered fields lay the enemy, the Americans. I was crouched with my unit in a shallow trench, half covered in snow, trying to keep the cold from creeping into my core. My breath turned into small clouds in front of me, and I could feel the frost clinging to my eyelashes. The war had been dragging on for so long, and now, as we prepared for one last desperate offensive, I felt the weight of it more than ever. Exhaustion, hunger, the endless cold, it all pressed down on me like a heavy burden I couldn't shake. Beside me, Fritz, a grizzled veteran from Berlin, grunted as he shifted his weight, trying to find some comfort in the icy ground. "It's like fighting in Siberia," he muttered, his voice low and rough. I only nodded. It did feel like Siberia, like a frozen hell, but this was the Ardennes, and we were about to launch what they called the last gamble. Command had briefed us on the plan. A massive counterattack through the Ardennes to split the Allied lines and drive them back to the sea. We all knew what was at stake. If we succeeded, the war could turn in our favor. If we failed, well, I didn't want to think about that. But the odds were against us. The Americans had numbers, equipment, and supplies that we could only dream of, but we had one thing on our side: surprise. As night fell, the air seemed to grow even colder. I pulled my coat tighter around me, feeling the hard metal of my rifle against my chest. The wind howled through the trees, and the occasional creak of the forest around us was the only sound. Time dragged on, minutes turning into hours, and yet we remained motionless, tense, waiting. At some point I must have dozed off. Despite the cold, I was jolted awake by the sound of movement, a whispered command from our officer. It was time. The attack was about to begin. My heart began to race as I gripped my rifle tighter, the cold metal familiar, almost comforting. I looked at Fritz, who gave me a grim nod. The artillery started, the first thunderous roars shattering the stillness of the night. The ground trembled beneath us as the shells flew overhead, landing in the distance with deafening blasts. The bombardment would soften the enemy's defenses, or so we hoped. In the chaos of those first moments, there was no time to think, only to act. We had our orders, and we would follow them no matter the cost. As the shelling continued, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fear and tension of the past few days were gone, replaced by something colder, harder. The war had already taken so much from us: our youth, our innocence, our friends, and now it demanded more. With a final glance at Fritz and the other men in my unit, I steeled myself for what was to come. The officer gave the signal, and we moved out, leaving behind the cover of the trees and stepping into the snow-covered fields. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Into the fire. As we moved out of the tree line and into the open, the world around us exploded in violence. The shells from our artillery continued to pound the American positions, lighting up the night with flashes of fire and sending up huge plumes of earth and snow. The once quiet forest now echoed with the sound of battle, the distant rattle of machine guns, the dull thud of explosions, and the occasional scream, lost in the chaos. We advanced slowly at first, keeping low to the ground, our eyes scanning the horizon for movement. The snow crunched beneath our boots, a sound that seemed too loud in the moments between the bursts of artillery. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. Every step forward felt like a march into the unknown, the icy wind cutting through my uniform as we pressed on. Then the return fire came. The Americans had regrouped faster than we anticipated. Bright traces of machine gun fire ripped through the night, cutting across the snow-covered field like deadly streaks of light. I threw myself to the ground, the snow biting into my face as bullets whizzed ahead. The sound was deafening now: gunfire, explosions, and the shouts of men all around me. I crawled forward, keeping as low as possible, my rifle clutched tightly in my hands. Fritz was just ahead of me, urging me to keep moving. "We need to reach the ridge," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of battle. I nodded and pushed forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ridge was our objective. From there we could lay down suppressing fire and hopefully break through the American defenses. As we neared the ridge, I saw the dark shapes of other men from our unit moving up ahead, silhouetted against the firelit sky. Suddenly an explosion rocked the ground to my right, and a shower of snow and dirt rained down over me. One of our men had stepped on a mine, his body thrown into the air by the blast. I froze for a moment, paralyzed by the shock of it, but Fritz grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "Keep moving," he shouted. There was no time to think, no time to mourn. We scrambled up the ridge, the sounds of the battle growing even more intense. By now, our artillery had stopped, and the Americans were fully aware of our presence. The gunfire from their positions was relentless, forcing us to keep our heads down as we struggled to find cover behind the rocks and snowbanks at the top of the ridge. I could see the enemy positions below us now, flashes of muzzle fire in the darkness. It was hard to make out anything clearly in the chaos, but I knew we were facing a well-entrenched force. I raised my rifle and began firing, aiming at the flickers of movement in the distance. My shots felt desperate, almost meaningless against the overwhelming noise and confusion of the battlefield. All around me, men were shouting orders, but it was hard to tell who was still alive and who had fallen. The chaos of the assault was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if the world had been reduced to this small, frozen patch of land where life and death hung by a thread. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, an American soldier emerging from a foxhole below, trying to flank us. Then, without thinking, I swung my rifle toward him and fired. He crumpled to the ground, disappearing into the snow. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. I stared at the spot where he had fallen, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. This was real. This was war. But there was no time to dwell on it. The battle raged on, and we had to keep pushing. Our officers were shouting for us to advance, to break through the American lines. I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my legs from the cold, and continued to fire as I moved forward with the others. The ridge had become a killing ground, with bodies of both our men and the Americans littering the snow, their blood staining the white landscape. We fought for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the midst of the battle. Eventually we began to gain ground. The American fire slackened, and we could see their soldiers retreating, pulling back to more defensible positions. The ridge was ours, but at a heavy cost. As the gunfire began to die down, I found myself standing in a field of corpses, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. My hands were trembling from the cold and the adrenaline, and I felt numb all over. Fritz stumbled up beside me, his face covered in grime and exhaustion. He clapped me on the shoulder, his voice hoarse. "We did it." I nodded, but inside I felt nothing. We had taken the ridge, yes, but at what cost? The battle was far from over, and the cold, unforgiving night still stretched out before us. Our objective had been to secure the high ground and establish a forward position, but now, with so few of us left and our supplies running dangerously low, it felt like a hollow victory. Fritz sat beside me, his face pale, lips blue from the cold, his eyes distant. His breath came out in sharp, visible puffs in the freezing air. He didn't speak, and neither did I. There wasn't much to say anymore. Frozen resolve. In the distance I could hear the muffled groans of the wounded. We had tried to bring in as many as we could, dragging them back up the ridge after the battle, but not all had made it. I could still see a few bodies lying down the slope, covered in snow, their limbs twisted in unnatural positions. There were too many to bury, and the ground was too hard to dig. The cold, however, had become our real enemy. It sapped our strength, creeping into every part of us, no matter how many layers of clothing we wore. My feet had gone numb hours ago, and the frostbite was spreading. I could barely move my fingers, let alone grip my rifle properly. The others looked just as bad, frostbitten faces, cracked skin, eyes dull with exhaustion. Even our guns had frozen in the cold, making every task, even reloading, a struggle. By morning, the ridge was ours, but the toll had been devastating. The men, or what was left of them, were huddled in makeshift positions. The bitter cold gnawed at every part of my body. The snow, now stained with blood, covered the fallen, and the air smelled of gunpowder, smoke, and death. The silence after the battle felt unnatural, almost eerie, as if the forest itself had swallowed the sounds of war. "Do you think they'll counterattack?" Fritz finally broke the silence, his voice trembling, more from fear than the cold. "They will," I replied, my voice steady, though inside I felt far less certain. "They'll want this ridge back, but we'll hold it." I looked out toward the valley below. The American lines were quiet, too quiet. Their withdrawal the night before had felt like a temporary reprieve, not a retreat. I could sense it deep down. A new offensive was coming, and we were in no shape to defend against it. "Here they come," someone shouted from down the line. The men began to stir, gripping their rifles and checking their ammunition. But we all knew it, there wasn't enough left. The last of our artillery had been used the night before, and our supplies were dangerously low. Fritz didn't respond, he just nodded, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew what was coming. And it wasn't just the Americans we had to worry about. The weather, the lack of supplies, the frostbite, it was all conspiring against us. It felt like we were fighting not just the enemy but the very land itself. Hours passed, the cold seeping deeper into my bones. We had no food, and what little water we had was frozen solid. I could see some of the men trying to scrape snow into their mouths, their teeth chattering as they chewed on the ice. I did the same, the cold stinging my throat as I swallowed. "Get ready," our officer barked, his voice hoarse from the cold and the strain of command. He was a tough man, but even he looked worn down, his face gaunt, eyes hollow. There was no time for strategy now. We would hold the ridge, or we would die trying. Then, just before noon, the sound of engines broke the silence. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my frozen limbs, and peered over the ridge. In the distance, I could see them American tanks, moving slowly through the snow, flanked by infantry. They were coming for us. Sir. The tanks rumbled closer, their tracks tearing through the snow, while the infantry moved in behind them, using the armored vehicles as cover. We opened fire, our rifles cracking in the cold air. The first shots were wild, the men's hands shaking too much to aim properly, but soon we found our rhythm, the crack of gunfire blending with the roaring engines and the distant boom of mortars. The Americans were relentless, pushing forward with grim determination. I fired shot after shot, the recoil jarring my frozen limbs. The enemy was close now, too close. I could see their faces, their helmets, the way they moved with purpose, as if nothing would stop them, and maybe nothing would. I struggled to my feet, my vision blurry. Fritz was next to me, shouting something, but I couldn't hear him. Blood trickled from his temple and his rifle was nowhere to be seen. I reached for my own weapon, but my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. Suddenly, a shell exploded nearby, sending snow and dirt flying into the air. I was thrown to the ground, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. For a moment everything went dark, and all I could hear was a dull ringing in my ears. When I opened my eyes, the battle was still raging, but everything felt distant, as if I were watching it from somewhere far away. I raised my rifle, aiming at the nearest figure, and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. I tried again, but my hands were numb, useless. The enemy was too close now, and I knew I wouldn't be able to stop them. The Americans were almost upon us now. I could see them charging up the ridge, their bayonets glinting in the pale winter sun. There was no time left, no time to regroup or plan. It was a desperate last stand. I watched in disbelief as they retreated, their tanks reversing down the slope, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The ridge was still ours, but just barely. Just as I thought it was over, I heard a shout from behind me. Reinforcements, German troops emerging from the trees, charging into the fray. Sire, the tide of battle turned in an instant, and the Americans, caught off guard, began to fall back. Fritz collapsed beside me, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We did it," he whispered, though I wasn't sure if he believed it. I looked out over the battlefield at the bodies strewn across the snow, the blood staining the ground. We had held the ridge, but at what cost? We were broken, battered, and barely alive. And the winter was far from over.